The shotgun was the first thing William Harper saw when the door swung open. Not the woman holding it, though she came into focus quickly enough, but the barrel, long and dark, and leveled with the kind of steadiness that told him this wasn't the first time she'd pointed it at a stranger. He stopped walking, lifted both hands slowly, letting his worn leather satchel dangle from his fingers like a flag of surrender. "I'm not armed," he said, "and I'm not trouble. Every man who's ever stood on my porch said something close to that." Her voice was flat, certain. "Keep your hands where I can see them." He did. Abigail Turner stood in the doorway of the farmhouse like she'd been built into it, solid, composed, her dark hair pinned back without ceremony, her dress plain and functional. She was 30 years old, and there wasn't a soft edge on her. Not in her posture, not in her eyes, not in the finger resting alongside the trigger guard with practiced calm. William took her in the way a man does when he knows one wrong word ends the conversation permanently. She wasn't afraid of him. That much was clear. She was simply measuring him, the way you measure lumber before you decide if it's worth cutting. "My name is William Harper," he said. "I came from Dodge City, before that Wichita. I heard in town that the Turner farm might be looking for hands." "You heard wrong. Ma'am, I'm not asking for wages." He kept his voice even. "I'm asking for a roof. The barn would do. In exchange, I work. Sun up to sundown, whatever needs doing. Fencing, planting, irrigation, livestock, I know the work. Every drifter knows the work until the first hard week." She hadn't lowered the gun. "Then they disappear and leave things worse than they found them." "I won't disappear. That's also been said before." She looked at him a long moment, at the road dust on his coat, the cracked leather of his boots, the hat that had been through at least 2 Kansas summers and showed every one of them. She looked at his hands, still raised, and she noticed what most people would have missed. They were calloused in the right places. Not the soft palms of a man pretending at labor, but the specific, hardened skin of someone who had driven fence posts and pulled rope and guided a plow across resistant earth for years. She noticed, but she didn't lower the gun. "I don't take in strays, Mr. Harper. I'm not asking for charity, I'm proposing a trade. I heard what you proposed." She tilted her chin slightly toward the road. "Millhaven is 6 miles east. There's a boarding house. Mrs. Creddy takes in men willing to work for room and board. I passed through Millhaven." He held her gaze. "I heard about your situation from a man named Porter at the feed store. He mentioned the Turner farm. 200 acres, he said. A woman running it alone since last winter." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, more like the drawing back of a curtain to reveal a harder surface beneath. "Edgar Porter talks too much," she said quietly. "He talked enough." William lowered his hand slightly, slowly, watching her eyes for permission. She didn't raise the gun further, so he continued. "I also heard about the letter from the land office. Something about a debt note coming due in 60 days. The silence that followed was the heaviest kind. Abigail Turner had received that letter 3 weeks ago. She'd read it 4 times, burned it on the 5th reading, and told exactly no one. Not the neighbors, not the reverend, not the women at Sunday service who watched her with that particular combination of pity and curiosity she'd come to despise. She had kept the problem sealed inside herself the way you keep a cracked dam, with sheer pressure and determination, praying it held until she figured out the solution. And now this stranger on her porch knew about it. "Get off my land," she said. Her voice was quieter now, which made it more dangerous. "Ma'am, I said get off." He picked up his satchel, settled his hat, turned and walked 3 steps down the porch, and then stopped because he'd heard it before she said a word. The low, strained groan of old timber giving way, followed by the crash of the south fence section collapsing against the post. Across the yard, 4 of her cattle moved immediately toward the gap, slow and inevitable as water finding its level. William set down his satchel, walked to the fence, and had the cattle turned back and the post braced with a fallen rail inside 4 minutes. He didn't look back at her while he did it. He didn't make a show of the work. He simply did what needed doing, with the efficient, unhurried confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. When he finished, he walked back to the porch, picked up his satchel, and looked up at her. The shotgun was no longer raised. It hung at her side. Her expression hadn't changed, but something behind it had. "The barn," she said finally, the words arriving like they cost her something. "You sleep there. You eat after I've eaten. You don't come into this house unless I call for you. You leave the moment I tell you to leave, no argument, no delay." "Agreed," William said. "And Mr. Harper," her eyes held his with the full weight of everything she wasn't saying, "I'll be watching." He nodded once. I'd expect nothing less. 3 weeks passed and the Turner farm began to breathe again. It happened gradually, the way recovery always does, not in dramatic moments, but in small, accumulating evidence. A repaired irrigation channel that now pulled water evenly across the east field. A chicken coop re-leveled and relatched so the losses to foxes stopped overnight. 2 acres of compacted soil broken up and reseeded using a rotation pattern that Abigail hadn't seen applied since her father worked land in Ohio, 30 years ago and 500 miles away. She watched all of it from careful distances, said little, adjusted nothing. William worked without instruction and without complaint. He was up before her every morning. She knew because the barn lantern was always already lit when she stepped onto the porch at first light, and the sound of labor reached her before she'd finished her coffee. He asked questions only when necessary, listened completely when she answered, and never once pushed against the boundaries she'd drawn on that first evening. The farm improved. She noticed. She didn't say so. What she noticed more, though she wouldn't have admitted it to anyone in Millhaven, was how he worked. There was knowledge in it that didn't fit the picture of a drifter passing through Kansas with a worn satchel and cracked boots. When one of her mares developed a respiratory infection, William didn't guess at the treatment. He diagnosed it, named it, and described the precise herbal compress remedy in the same breath, with the quiet confidence of someone recalling education rather than experience. When he restructured the irrigation channel, he sketched the revised gradient in the dirt first, using calculations she recognized as deliberate and accurate. Drifters didn't do that. She filed the observation away and said nothing. The town, however, said plenty. Millhaven was the kind of small that made everyone's business communal property. By the end of the second week, Abigail had received 3 visits from well-meaning neighbors and 1 pointed conversation after Sunday service from Reverend Dalton, who spoke carefully about appearances and propriety, and the particular vulnerability of a young widow's reputation. She had listened to all of it with the same expression she wore for bad weather, acknowledging its presence without granting it any power over her plans. But the pressure accumulated. She felt it. It was on a Tuesday evening, mending a pile of work clothes she'd collected from the barn, William's coat among them, badly torn along the left shoulder seam, that she found the letter. It had slipped into the inner lining through a torn pocket seam. She wouldn't have seen it at all except that it crinkled under her needle and she pulled it free automatically, thinking it was a scrap of paper, something meaningless. It wasn't. The envelope was of good quality, the kind that came from offices, not from ordinary correspondence. The return address read, Harper Land and Cattle Holdings, Wichita, Kansas. The name at the top of the letter inside read, William Caldwell Harper III. She read it twice. Then she set down her needle. Caldwell Harper. The name she'd been quietly dreading since the letter arrived from the land office. Caldwell Harper, whose debt note held her farm's future in its grip, whose representative had twice ridden through Millhaven asking questions about the Turner property's productivity and acreage. The man who had foreclosed on the Granger family east of town, the Pattersons north of it, and 3 other farms across the county in the past 2 years alone. William was his son. She was sitting on the porch when he came in from the fields at dusk, and the expression on her face stopped him at the yard's edge the way a fence stops cattle, instantly and completely. She held up the letter. The silence between them stretched long enough to hear the grasshoppers in the south field and the distant sound of the creek running low after the dry spell. William didn't look away from her eyes. He didn't reach for the letter or pretend confusion. He simply stood there and absorbed the full weight of what she now knew. How long did you think you could keep this hidden? Her voice was controlled, precisely controlled, which was more frightening than anger. I wasn't hiding it to deceive you, he said. You're Caldwell Harper's son. The man trying to take this land. You've been living in my barn for 3 weeks. She stood up from the porch step. What exactly would you call that? A complication, he said quietly, and a mistake in how I handled it. I should have told you sooner. You should have told me the morning you arrived. Yes, he said. No argument, no defense. She walked to the porch railing and looked out at the fields, the repaired fields, the breathing fields, and for one terrible moment, William saw what it cost her to stand there. Not rage, something worse. The specific devastation of a person who had chosen, against every careful instinct, to begin trusting again and found the ground unstable beneath it. Leave, she said. Tonight. Abigail, don't. The word was a door closing. Take your things and go, Mr. Harper. He opened his mouth, closed it, and nodded once. He walked toward the barn. He didn't see the riders until they crested the hill at the north end of the property, 4 horses, moving with the deliberate pace of men who already believed the land beneath them was theirs. At the front, unmistakable even at distance, rode Caldwell Harper. William stopped walking the moment he saw them. 4 riders, North Hill, moving slow and certain, the way men move when they've already decided how something ends. He recognized the broad silhouette at the front before the distance closed enough to confirm it. The straight-backed posture, the silver-gray horse, the particular arrogance of a man who had never once in his life been told no by anything that couldn't be purchased or pressured into agreement. His father, William, turned back toward the porch. Abigail was already watching the riders, her hand moving automatically to the porch post as though steadying herself against something only she could feel arriving. Go inside, William said. She looked at him sharply. This is my land. I know it is. That's why I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes. He held her gaze with something she hadn't seen in his face before, not the quiet competence of the past 3 weeks, but something older and more resolved. Please, Abigail, inside. Let me handle this first. She searched his face for a long, suspended moment. Then she stepped back through the doorway, not in retreat, he understood that clearly, in strategy. Caldwell Harper rode into the yard with his 3 men flanking him like punctuation marks on a sentence already written. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with a silver mustache and the well-fed confidence of a man who had spent decades converting other people's hardship into his own prosperity. He pulled his horse up and looked down at William with an expression that moved through surprise, recognition, and cold amusement in rapid succession. Well, Caldwell said. William. He made the name sound like a disappointment he'd long since made peace with. I wondered where you'd landed. Father. William stood in the center of the yard, hands loose at his sides. You've ridden a long way for nothing. Caldwell smiled and reached into his coat, producing a folded legal document with the practiced ease of a man who had used paper as a weapon his entire career. Judge Harmon signed this morning. Debt recovery order on the Turner property. 60 days expired as of yesterday. He looked around the yard with the evaluating eye of an appraiser. I'll admit the place looks better than I expected. That'll improve the resale. That document is fraudulent, William said. The smile didn't waver. Strong word, son. It's an accurate word. William reached into his own coat, slowly, deliberately, aware of the 3 sets of hands shifting near holsters, and produced a folded envelope of his own. The original debt note carried by the Turner farm, was purchased by Harper Holdings 14 months ago from the Millhaven Savings Bank. What wasn't disclosed to Mrs. Turner or to the county land office was that the sale of that note involved the forgery of her late husband's signature on a transfer agreement, a signature produced 8 months after Robert Turner was already in the ground. The yard went very quiet. "I've spent the better part of 6 months documenting it," William continued, his voice remaining steady and unhurried. "Signed affidavits from 2 bank clerks in Wichita, a handwriting analysis from a court examiner in Topeka, and a letter from Federal Marshal Cord Davies of the Wichita District, who has been building a case against Harper Holdings land acquisition practices across 4 counties." He held up the envelope. "This is a copy. Marshal Davies has the original. He rode into Millhaven this morning." Caldwell's smile had not disappeared entirely, but it had changed character, thinner now, recalculating. "You did this," he said quietly. "Not a question." "You taught me how business works," William said. "I just applied it honestly." It was at precisely that moment that the door behind William opened. He hadn't called for her. She hadn't waited to be called. Abigail Turner walked out of her house and across the porch and down the steps, and stood beside William Harper in the center of her yard with her shoulders straight and her chin level in the full, undiminished authority of a woman who had held 200 acres together through grief and pressure and 60 days of genuine terror, and had not broken once. She reached out and took the fraudulent document directly from Caldwell Harper's hand before he could react or object. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she tore it in half and half again and let the pieces fall into the Kansas dirt at her feet. "This land," she said, looking up at Caldwell Harper with absolute calm, "is not for sale. It is not collectible. And you will not return to it." Caldwell looked at her, looked at William, looked at the pieces of his document on the ground. Behind him, at the North Hills crest, 2 riders appeared, Federal Marshal Davies and his deputy, moving at an unhurried pace that meant they'd been watching long enough to see everything they needed to see. Caldwell Harper left in handcuffs before sunset. His men rode ahead of the marshal without resistance, the particular deflation of men whose borrowed authority had simply run out. The yard was quiet afterward, the good kind of quiet. Abigail stood beside William and looked out at the fields she had refused to surrender, and after a long moment she said, without looking at him, "You came here deliberately, for me." "I came here," he said carefully, "because I knew what was coming. I stayed because of something I didn't expect." She looked at him then. "You could have told me everything on the first day," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I was afraid you'd send me away before I could help. I nearly sent you away anyway." "I know." A pause. "I'm glad you didn't." The sun dropped low over the south field, painting everything amber and gold, and neither of them spoke for a while because some things settle better in silence. 6 months later, Millhaven turned out in full. They gathered on the front porch of the Turner farm on a bright October Saturday, neighbors and Reverend and feed store owner Edgar Porter, who cried openly and without embarrassment. The porch had been repaired and repainted. The fields behind it were harvested clean and ready for winter. The barn stood solid against the Kansas sky. Abigail wore a cream dress that had belonged to Robert Turner's mother, altered carefully at the sleeves. She had pinned her dark hair back the same practical way she always did, and she carried no flowers because she had never seen the point of carrying something you couldn't keep. She looked, William thought, exactly like herself, which was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He stood in a clean dark suit that Edgar Porter had quietly sourced from the Millhaven dry goods store, and when Abigail reached him at the porch steps and looked at him with those measuring honest eyes, he felt the same thing he'd felt that first evening in the yard, that he was being assessed completely, and that this time every part of him had been found sufficient. Reverend Dalton, who had once spoken carefully about appearances and propriety, spoke now about courage and faithfulness, and the particular grace of two people who had chosen honesty over convenience at every difficult turn. When it was finished, William took Abigail's hand, calloused against calloused, earned against earned, and she held it without reservation, without condition, without any of the careful distance she had maintained for so long. The farm behind them stood quiet and whole in the October light. It was theirs,